All right. Well, I think a few folks are still joining us, but we are going to get kicked off. So, welcome to Tableau for Excel users. I'm really excited about this webinar. I'm happy that you all have been able to make it here today. So, thanks so much for joining for this. I think this webinar has been a long time in the making. It's been something I've been thinking about for years, and so it's fun to finally get pen to paper, so to speak, and to be able to put this together and roll it out for you all. So. Um, yeah, let me just start out with a little bit of a background for like what was the purpose of, and what was kind of the backstory for creating this. So I think a lot of people are making that move to Tableau, right? Maybe it's a new role that you're in or just something that you've been thinking about, and you've got some background in some other data tools, maybe something like Excel, and you're just trying to figure out how do these skills translate? When should I use Excel? When should I use Tableau? What does the relationship like between these tools look like? And so that was really, a lot of the inspiration for doing this. And I think that having a background in Excel is a great springboard for being able to have a successful career using Tableau. So let me jump into a little personal background, and then we will start talking about some of the content. So very nice to see some of you again. So for former students or folks that have been through the webinars, clients, things like that, thanks so much for being here. So my name is Eric. I live in the Seattle area. My journey of using Tableau started. I sat next to a Tableau consultant on the plane in Thanksgiving 2013. It's the first time I ever heard of this company. And yeah, so really 2014 got underway and have been using it just about daily since then. Like I'm sure a lot of you on the call have been using Excel since as early as I can remember. Probably started using it not too long after I started using a computer. So a lot of background, a lot of years in these tools, and my day-to-day life is pretty well divided between teaching classes. So I'm actually teaching at least a couple weeks a month, and then doing consulting work. So I've got a handful of clients I work with, helping them advance their Tableau projects and do the data engineering or the visualization or the sharing or whatever that might look like. So some hands-on practical experience, some teaching experience, and all of that will come into play here a bit with what we talk about today. All right. So why are we here? Like, what are we hoping to get out of our time together? So I would say a few things come to mind. I think it would be great to review the history of these tools, which will be kind of funny. It's funny to go back to the early beginnings of both these softwares and see what they look like. We'll talk about the relationship between the tools, when you would want to use one versus the other, and for those that are, maybe experienced in Excel, but maybe just getting your feet wet in Tableau, we're going to look at some core things that you like to do in Excel and how you can actually do those things in Tableau if and when needed. Okay. So let's go ahead and start with the history of Excel. So Excel actually first released the very initial version of what is our Excel today in the early 1980s as something called multi-plan. That predates me, but I'm going to show an image of multi-plan here in a minute. I bet my colleague Kirk, who's on the line, he's going to help with questions. I bet he might remember that. And the first thing that looked maybe a little bit more like the Excel we know today came around more so in the late 1980s. It was originally designed for a couple purposes, to not only be a data input tool, but to help with analysis as well, right? So, back in the day, you had your pen and paper, and you're writing it all out, you're doing your longhand division, and like forget about it, right? It's not worth it. So that's where a tool like Multiplan or now Excel comes into play. To be able to help you, write formulas and do math in a much more efficient and repeatable manner. So just for a little throwback for those of you that might remember it, I did a little Googling around, and this is what I found for multi-plans. So there you go. That's the theoretically, that's what the very early beginnings of Excel looked like. And then, of course, Excel today is a little more advanced. You got some more features. You got the toolbar at the top with hundreds of different types of formulas and customizations that you can do. Okay, so I would say the purpose of Excel today, I mean, it's kind of funny. In a lot of ways, it's still largely just used the same way that it always was, right? People use it for data input. People use it for sort of, basic formulas like summing a column or, writing a formula to be able to calculate across multiple columns. So all of that is still valid. But the Excel of today is, of course, a lot more advanced than the Excel of yesteryear. You might be using it to be able to output data from another system to be able to analyze it. Excel, a lot of people don't use it for that, but it actually does have a fair amount of data visualization capability. You can use it to be able to share data, to be able to write macros and automate processes. So Excel has actually become a really powerful standalone tool, or in some cases, a complementary tool that you would use in conjunction with another one. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at the background of Tableau now. Okay, so Tableau is a little bit younger. The kind of first concepts of it came up in the late 90s, and then it was officially founded in the early 2000s. The backstory there is that some folks from the Department of Defense went to the computer science department at Stanford and said, hey, we've got, hundreds of tables, thousands of tables with millions of records, and we can't analyze it quickly. And every visual and thing that we do is custom and one-off, and it's very coding intensive, and it's not flexible. Can you help us? And so that was kind of what ended up the conversation that spurred what became Tableau. So the idea behind Tableau is that it's supposed to be, minimal coding, drag and drop, user-friendly, take a lot of data, be able to visualize it and analyze it easier, be able to share it with others. Okay. So Tableau 1.0, the earliest image that I could find looked like this. This is a real grainy little thumbnail on Tableau's website. So it's kind of funny. I mean, you can definitely see some similarities to what the Tableau of today looks like. And then our more recent version of Tableau, this is actually Tableau in the browser. Today we're using Tableau on the desktop, but like Excel, it's come a long ways. Okay, so what's the purpose of Tableau? We talked about that a little bit there, but I would say a few other things to add to that conversation. So Tableau is meant to be very data source agnostic. Like, it doesn't care if you have an Excel file or a CSV or a SQL table or Redshift or Oracle, or like throw whatever. Tableau's got over 100 native connectors, and then there's a lot of documentation, different ways to connect to things that maybe even aren't on that list. It's meant to be a visual tool first and foremost, to be able to help you take your data from a rows and columns format and be able to turn it into meaningful and interactive visuals. They want it to be able to be shared with businesses, audiences, and then it's got pretty advanced capabilities around creating permissions for individual users and for groups, so that people just see the data that they are supposed to. Okay, so for those that are, maybe you've got most of your time is spent in Excel and you're a little skeptical, why would you want to use Tableau? What value would this add to your life? So a few things come to mind. First, if your data is not in Excel, then it probably doesn't make sense to analyze it in Excel, or maybe I should say it might not make sense. So if it's already, in a database somewhere, yeah, I guess you could, in some cases, take it to Excel, but probably going to do better in a system that's designed to be able to handle data coming from a database. If you have data in Excel, but that's only a piece of the puzzle, and you need to combine that with some other data, then you might want to consider Tableau. If you want to quickly explore data in a visual manner, if you want to just within a couple clicks switch between different visual types and be able to explore and sort, filter your data, that's really what Tableau is geared toward. Excel data source sizes can be kind of limiting, right? I don't know if anybody here has run into the old 1 million row limit, but that can kind of stop you in your tracks if you're dealing with larger amounts of data. And then again, there is the ability, through something like O365 to be able to set up permissions for, Excel-based content, but it's not easy necessarily, even if it is possible. Okay. So that's a little background on these tools, a little background on why would you use one versus the other. I still use both in my day-to-day. Let me just say that before we move on. I love both. Some people want to try and pit these things against each other. No way. These are they're not in competition for the most part. Sure, there's things that you can do in both tools, but Excel is great for data input, some data manipulation. It's great for showing data in a tabular manner, being able to do all kinds of conditional formatting to your cells. But if I want to build visuals and explore and filter and make it interactive, that's where I'm going to turn to Tableau. Okay. So that'll kind of help us turn the corner to talk about what are some core things that you do in Excel that as you make your way to Tableau, you might want to be able to do there as well. Okay. So I wrote down a list of about a dozen things. So we will plan on covering how to do these things in Tableau. But also, if you have other ideas and suggestions, then feel free to send those my way. You can use the questions or the chat dialogue here and go to webinar. I'm hoping that we have time at the end of this session to be able to cover that. So yeah, we'll hope that we have that and we'll dig into it as we can. Okay. So first up, let me show you the data source that I'm going to be using for some of these examples. This is a little bit of a doctored version of the data source because I wrote some Excel formulas in here that I want to talk about. But we're going to be dealing with one of Tableau's classic data sets, which is called Superstore. So I'm recording the session. I'll send you a link to the recording. I'm going to send you a link to my Tableau workbook. I'm going to send you a link to the data source. So you'll have links to all of this stuff here in the next couple of days. But to just explain this data source briefly, so each row of data in this orders sheet is one transaction that occurred at this business. So somebody bought a bike, somebody bought a printer or a chair, and then it captures some information about the customer, who are they, where are they from, how much did that item cost, was it discounted, kind of on and on like that, right? There are a couple other tables with some supplementary information. So there's a people table that just tells me who is the manager of different regions. There's a returns table, which just lists an order ID if it happened to get returned. And that's pretty much it. So orders, I want to say, we'll do a row count here in Excel. Why don't we? So if I select the order ID column, it's probably a little small. Let me see if I can zoom in on that for you. So we're talking about 10,000 or so records here in the orders table. 4 in people, and certainly fewer, 800 or so in the returns table. Okay. One other important distinction just to understand about this data is that an order ID, it does not have a one-to-one relationship with the row, meaning like if you went on Amazon today and you bought a pair of shoes and that was it, that was your whole order, boom, that would just show up as one row of data here. But if you bought shoes, socks, and a hat, that would show up as 3 different rows, but a single order ID. So I just want to call that out because the language I'll be using here today, sometimes I'll talk about orders, which is might be multiple items, or sometimes I'll talk about transaction. And when I say transaction, I just mean like a single item that somebody bought. Okay, so all that's not super important, but just to kind of help give a little bit of context to our vocabulary and our discussion. All right, so we looked at how to do a row count here in Excel. So how do you do something like that in Tableau? Okay, I've already connected to this data source, so I don't need to redo that necessarily. But just to show you, if you did need to connect to a data source, when you first boot Tableau up, it's going to have you in a little bit of a different window. But if I hit new data source from my data drop down on the toolbar, it's going to pull up a similar connect pane that you would see on the left side of Tableau when you load it for the first time. And so I would just go through Excel here and select the Superstore and then grab the orders table. So just to show you what this looks like in the data source tab, you can see here's my connection to Excel, and then here are those tables or sheets in Excel, orders, people, and returns that we just looked at. So I grab orders, drag and drop it out here. Now I'm working with my orders data. All right, so back to my worksheet. How many rows of data are there in this data source? Well, I've got good news for you. Being able to answer that is pretty easy. So depending on what version of Tableau you're using, there's either going to be the name of the table that you're working with and then the word count, or there might be a field called number of records if you're working with a little older version of Tableau. Regardless, both of those are just row counts. So if I just grabbed orders count and threw that on text here in the marks card, what that would do is that would show me, oh, okay, there's 10,194 rows in our orders table. How does that check out? Select that here. I'm getting a 10,195, but it's counting the header. So that's perfect. That's the same thing. Okay. This is going to come into play a little bit later, but I just want to call it out right now. So something that you will notice is that I grabbed that orders count from this section of Tableau. This is called the data pane. So just to add a little vocabulary to what we're talking about. And in the data pane, Tableau categorizes your fields into dimensions, which are fields that you use to categorize data. Right, so when we talk about a dimension, we mean things like geographies, dates, IDs, business units. And then we've also got in the bottom, there's like a little gray line right there. You can see we've got measures, and measures are the numerical fields you want to analyze. Right, so that would be things like sales or headcount or grades or whatever it is, depending on what kind of industry that you work in. Okay, so that orders count, that's a measure. And it's just basically, you can just think about it as like it's basically just a 1 for every row of data. So if you just got the sum of all of those records, then it would end up being something like that. Okay. And we're not talking about filtering yet, but just a little preview. If we did want to filter this worksheet, like, hey, how many records were there in California? Yeah, that count would update to reflect, oh, how many records were there for just that context. All right, let's talk about use case number 2, pivot tables. Okay, so let me flip back to Excel here. I've actually pre-created a pivot table. So here I just made a pivot table of order ID and sales amount, right? So sometimes the orders are multiple items. So I can see here's an order that was $32, $10, $281, etc. So, this is actually 5,000 records as opposed to closer to 10,000. So how do you create something like a pivot table in Tableau? Well, that's very core to what Tableau does. I mean, in some ways, again, if you're coming from the world of Excel, pretty much all Tableau does is create pivot tables. So if I flip over to this worksheet here, so this says, what is our total sales and profit by state? Okay, I'm going to find my state field in the data pane. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this field to my rows shelf. Okay, so these are our rows and columns shelves. And these are sort of building blocks for how you set up worksheets in Tableau. So if I want 1 row per state, I put state on the row shelf. Right. So now I can see that listed there. It just sorted alphabetically. You can see starting with Alabama, working our way down to Wyoming. And so now to see the sales and profit amounts, I'm just going to keep it as a text table for now. We'll talk about other types of visuals in a little bit. But if I grab sales and then drag and drop that on text in the marks card, okay, that would be my sum of all of my sales in Alabama. Okay, so notice the aggregation here, sum. And then if I want profit as another column, the easiest way actually to do this is just to double click on profit at this point. And then we'll add that as a second column. So now, using Excel language, I've got a pivot table, and I could just see, okay, cool. Alabama, our profit was $5,000. Our sales was more like 19,000. Okay. There's some ability to sort here as well. We're going to talk about sorting just a couple steps down the road, but just kind of a quick preview of that. I could just click the sort icon on either of these columns to bring, the one with the most profit or the one with the most sales to the top. Okay. So going back here to Excel, right? If sometimes in Excel you might want to change the aggregation, right? So maybe instead of the sum of sales, I want to see what's the average sales, per item in this order. So you can change aggregations in Tableau as well. A couple ways of doing that, but one quick way would be if I hit the drop down on one of these pills, so like sum of sales, there's an option here called measure. So I could say, oh, actually, what was my average sales amount in this state? Right, and that's going to return a very different amount. So California, the average sale, the average transaction was $229, but let me hit the back arrow up here. The overall sum of all sales was closer to $500,000. Okay, cool. Carrying forward. All right, time to talk about filters. So, it's very common in Excel that you'd want to come to a worksheet and hit a drop down and pick a state or pick a year, or whatever it is that you want to filter on. So how would you do that in Tableau? I'm going to mix up saying Excel and Tableau so much today. I've already started to do it. I know I'm going to do it more. Okay, so here's a question. Which orders in California had a sales amount of greater than $500? So I actually see two filters there. We need to filter on state and we need to filter on a sale amount. Okay, so I'm going to build a bar chart for this just to make it a little more visual. So I'm going to put order ID on rows. And then for sales, instead of putting sales on text, which creates this kind of more text table or crosstab, whatever you like to call it, if I put sum of sales on columns instead, Tableau is going to build a bar chart for me. So we don't have time today to explore tons of the different visual types in Tableau, but one of the resources that I'm going to link out in today's follow-up is called 10 Tableau chart types in 10 minutes. And that'll run you through kind of quick hits, like how to do a bar, how to do a scatter plot, how to do a map. So look out for that. That might be helpful if that's something you want to explore more. Okay, so to answer this question, I want to do two filters. So I'm going to grab state and I'm going to drag and drop that onto my filters card and just pick California. So notice right now, it's very small. I've got about 5,000 marks, so about 5,000 order IDs in this worksheet. So if I just hit California and say okay, you saw the visual change, and then now we're down to about 1,000 marks. So kind of impressive that like 20% of all of our orders are from California. And then greater than or equal to $500. So I'm going to get a copy of sales, put that on my filters card. It's going to ask me what aggregation I want to use. Typically, I would just recommend matching it to the pill in your worksheet. So since we already have sum of sales up here, let's just choose sum of sales here as well. And I'm going to set this to say at least $500. Okay, and so now we're all the way down to 247 orders that met that criteria. Okay, so right now we just set those filters up in a way that really only we can access them. But if you ever want your user to be able to access filters as well, you can hit the drop down on these pills and say show filters. Okay, so there's showing the state filter, here's showing the sales filter. So we're not really going to talk about publishing today, but if I did publish this to Tableau Public for the whole world to see, or Tableau Server, or Tableau Online or Cloud for just people in my organization to see, well, now they would have this filter. So if they wanted to see were there any orders in British Columbia that met this criteria, then they could update this worksheet to do that. Okay. And then some of the questions I'll answer in real time, some of them not. So there was a question there, how do you create a copy of the sales pill? Two things. In this case, I just grabbed another copy of sales from the data pane. But if you ever have a field and you just want to quickly take it somewhere else, but also leave it where it already is, if you just hold down the control key while you drag and drop that pill, then it will leave the original copy, like this case, sum of sales on columns, but I got another copy and got to throw it on label. Now I can see the labels at the end of the bars. All right, so let's talk about sorting. So this question, a lot of questions at the top of this worksheet. What are our top items by sales, profit, and quantity sold? So, probably not going to have the same answer that meets all three of those criteria. So to me, this sounds like a scenario where I need to give my user the flexibility to be able to sort of explore and answer the questions as needed. Okay, so I've got product name is basically item name, so I'll put that on my row shelf. And in this case, I'm going to create like a multi-bar chart, meaning there's going to be one bar for each of those three measures. So I'll start with sales and put that on the column shelf. I'm going to go ahead and grab profit and put that on my column shelf. And then I'm going to grab quantity and put that on my column shelf. Okay. So in order to answer these questions, kind of the most flexible way that my user would probably want to do this would be to use the sort buttons on each axis. So you'll notice that when I hover over an axis, just to the right of the axis title, a little bar chart icon pops up. That's to allow us to sort. So it's gonna toggle through 3 options. So first option, descending, high to low. Second option, ascending, low to high. And then third option would reset the default data order, which is in this case just gonna be alphabetical by product name. Cool. All right. So there's some other kind of crazy stuff we get to do with sorting, but that's the gist of what you need. Like for a lot of these things, I'll send a sorting video as well and a filtering video so you can dive deeper on either of those topics if you want to. VLOOKUPs. All right, this is a good one. So however you like to combine data from multiple sheets in Excel, a VLOOKUP is one of those. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember. There's a couple different ways to do it. But basically, flip back to Excel here, right? You might write a formula that would allow you to say, okay, look at the value in this column. So in this case, this VLOOKUP looks up a region name, and then it goes to my people table, and then it looks for a match over here. And then when it finds that match, it pulls back the regional manager. Okay. So this concept of a VLOOKUP in Excel, there's actually a couple different ways of doing this in Tableau, but I would say the closest thing that we have to this would probably be a join. So in Tableau, a join is actually, you set up the relationship between 2 tables of data, and you actually say, okay, does this column have a match in this column in this other sheet? Okay. So in some ways it's similar. I'll explain also how it's a little different once we get into it. So where I would need to go for this actually is back to my data source tab. Okay. And then I want to distinguish between 2 different ways of doing this in Tableau. So Tableau's like default way now is if I grabbed a second table like people, is it would try to create a relationship. We've got a whole nother webinar where we talked about joins versus relationships. It's not really a road that I want to go down right now. This may also work for you, but today I want to do joins. So the way that would work is I would go to my orders table. I'm going to hit the drop down on my connection and say open. And what I'm looking for here is when I see this little colored ribbon next to the orders table, I know I'm in the dialog. It's what Tableau calls the physical layer, which would allow us to be able to create a join. So what this looks like is if I grabbed people and then I just hover to the right of orders here, I don't want to drop it directly on top, just kind of off to the right somewhere. What Tableau is going to do is it's going to try and establish a connection between these tables. So in this case, it just defaulted to an inner join on region equals region. Coincidentally, I think that would actually be fine, and this would allow us to see who's the manager for every region, for every transaction. But let me just take a minute to kind of explain this dialogue here. So first of all, you need to tell Tableau, is there just one field that could match? Are there multiple criteria? In this case, it's just the region field that would find a match. But if you add like city and state, you might need to say city equals city, state equals state. So you can add multiple clauses if you need to. And then these join types basically allow you to say, based on what happens with when rows of data match, what do I want to occur? So in this case, of all of our 10,000 rows of data and orders, every single one of those should have a match in the people table. So it doesn't actually matter what join type I pick. I should get 10,000 rows of data in my result set. But let's say that there was just randomly a region that didn't have a manager right now, and as a result, there was no row of data for that region in the people table. Like, let's say there was like, I don't know, Northeast. We don't have a manager for that. There's nothing listed. So if I still want to keep those orders, I would want to make sure I did a left join because maybe only 8,000 of the 10,000 rows found a match. So the left join would make sure that those 2,000 unmatched rows still show up in our result set of data. Okay. So that's kind of the idea behind why there's different join types is this, if there's rows of data which may or may not find a match, what do you want to have happen with those? One more thing I want to say, which is again, it's not going to happen in this scenario, but if for some reason there were multiple matches found, so let's say, I don't know, let's say Ted Lasso is also the manager of the South. Like, that's confusing. You have two managers. So yeah, we probably want to clear that up organizationally. Well, a kind of a funny / nasty data thing is going to happen here. Every transaction that happened in the South is going to duplicate now because it's going to match to Fred Suzuki and it's going to match to Ted Lasso. So you got to be careful about looking out for data duplication with a join, because you might, your original 10,000 rows of data might now be 13,000 rows because there was 3,000 rows of data that ended up becoming 6,000 when it matched twice. So something to look out for. That's about as much detail as I want to dive into on joins right now. But if you have questions about that, feel free to let me know. And we do have some resources where we can talk about that further. So I would say, for just kind of my own purposes, I'm probably like, I don't know, 80% of the time using a left join, 15% of the time using an inner join, and the right and the outer. It's like that rare use case where I might need those. So I'm actually going to just join returns while we're here as well, because we're going to need that later. So if you remember, returns was like 800 rows of data, whereas orders was like 10,000. So this is actually one where we do need a left join. Otherwise, we're going to lose the orders that weren't returned. Okay, so let's go back to our VLOOKUP sheet. So the question at the top here was, whose region had the most sales? So in order to tackle that now, I'm going to grab region and put that on the row shell. And then this is kind of nice. Notice how what Tableau does is, once you've got multiple tables connected, it actually categorizes the fields by what table they came from. So now I could say, who's the regional manager? Let's put that on rows. And then let's grab sales, and let's put that on columns. And now I could see Sadie's region, which is the West. She had the most sales. Okay. So I know we took a few minutes to talk about the intricacies of joins, but I have to tell you what, to be fair, I use Tableau more than I use Excel, but I find joins and things like that, especially for simple use cases, so much easier than things like VLOOKUP. So hopefully that saves you some heartache if those are things that make you run your head into a wall. All right, what about an if error, right? So you might write formulas in Excel, and then sometimes it comes back with a valid value, and sometimes it comes back with an error. So you can write something, or you can write a formula in Excel that would say, if the error showed up, then do this thing, okay? So that same function is more or less called if null in Tableau. So let me show you an example of where we might want if null. So I'm going to pop into this little button here. It's called view data. It's going to show me what my underlying data looks like. And this is actually going to show me all the different tables of data that I joined. So if I scan over here, is it just showing me orders right now? What I was looking for was to see, oh yeah, there it is. So here's my order ID from my returns table. Actually, there should be a returns field which came with that as well. Yeah, there it is. So back to Excel. There's a column called returned that's just populated with a yes for orders that got returned. So if I scroll down far enough, I should find one. There they are. But the rest of these values are null. So if I want to be able to answer this question, how many orders were returned and how many weren't, I probably want that returned field, but watch what happens when I put this on rows. I have yes and I have null. So that doesn't look very nice. So maybe I want to tell Tableau, if you see that it's null, just say, no, it wasn't returned. So I actually need to write a calculation to do that. So I'm going to click on the returned field in my data pane, hit the drop down, and create a calculated field. So for all you kind of crazy Excel formula people, this is where we write formulas in Tableau. So I'm just going to write returned, yes, no, just got to give it a different name. And then what this formula looks like would be this. I would say if null returned, comma, no, in quotes. Okay. We don't have time to go through all of Tableau's formulas today, shocker, because there are hundreds of them. We'll send some of them in kind of follow-up resources, and then I'll talk about some other places that you might go to learn more about those if you want to. So this is valid, so I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to put this field on rows instead. So now you can see it looks a little nicer. We've got no, we've got yes. And then how many orders were returned and how many weren't. So I want a count of my orders, but it's a little tricky, right? I don't want a row count, not transaction. I want orders, but how does that work, right? Because I don't actually have a measure called orders. So I could write a calculation which would count my orders, or I'm going to show you a quick way of doing it. So my order ID, I'm going to right click and drag order ID to columns. Right, a left click and drag would give me a column for every single order ID, so I'd end up with thousands of columns, which would not look good. But if I right click and drag order ID to columns, Tableau says, first of all, I could just, again, put all the columns of the order IDs, or what I want to do is I want a distinct count, or count D of order ID. So what's the difference? Count is like a row count. Count distinct is a unique value count. So if an order was 10 items, I don't want to say it was returned 10 times. I just want it counted as, one return if it got sent back. So count distinct of order ID. So I'll say okay. Go ahead and flip my labels on. And I can see that, thankfully for us, the vast majority of our orders, in this case, 4,800, were not returned, and just maybe a little bit shy of 300 were. Okay. All right, next up would be if-then statements. So actually, I've just shot a video on this where I go in more detail. It'll be dropping in a couple weeks, so I'll keep you on the loop for that. But we'll do maybe kind of a simpler variety here today. So how is profitability for each subcategory? So I'm going to put subcategory on my row shelf. I'm going to put profit on my column shelf. I'm going to use the sort icon on the toolbar to bring the most profitable to the top. And let's say that we basically just want to set up a few different tiers for performance. I want everybody who made more than $20,000 to be one color, anybody else who was positive to be a second color, and then anybody who was negative to be a third color. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the drop down on profit and create a calculated field. I'll call this thing profit performance. And let's do this. I'm going to say if the sum of profit is greater than or equal to 20,000, then great. It's going to be a text output in quotes. Okay, my next line is I will say else if sum of profit is greater than 0, then good. Okay, and then finally I'll just say else not profitable, end. So this is sort of the syntax. So you might look at something like copiers and say $76,000. Didn't that meet both of these criteria? Isn't that greater than 20,000 and also greater than 0? So that's true. The way that Tableau works, though, is it just kind of works its way through your arguments sequentially. So, in this case, I started with the highest ones first and then worked at the middle and then just did a catch-all for everything else. So I usually just go, high to low or low to high, the way that I work my way through the arguments in that calculation. A couple other quick things. I did line breaks just to help my formula be easier to look at, but Tableau does not care. You could put it all on one line. You could break it up on multiple lines. And then I don't have time to talk about this in too much depth right now, but there's a very big difference between is the sum of profit greater than 0 versus is the profit greater than 0. If I asked if the profit is greater than 0 with no aggregation, I'm telling Tableau to look at every row of data and basically give me a true or false for that row. But by asking if the sum of profit is greater than 0, I'm telling Tableau to look at the level of data in the worksheet. So in this case, look at the subcategory profit. Was the sum of profit at the copier's level greater than or equal to 20,000? Yes or no? Right, so that aggregation is very important. We got a video coming out about that next week. So that's something you want to learn more about. That's coming out soon. So I put profit performance on color. I've got my 3 colors. I may not like them. I may want to change them. So I'm going to click on color in my marks card, edit colors, I'm just going to do a real quick edit here. So maybe great's dark blue, good is light blue, and not profitable is orange. Something like that. All right. Cool. So next up would be SUMIF. Okay, so we're going to kind of tackle SUMIF and COUNTIF together. So if these are formulas that you use in Excel, what was the total revenue from transactions with sales greater than or equal to $500? So I'm going to show you two different ways of doing this. The first would just be just using filters. So if I put sum of sales on text, it's going to start by telling me my total of all sum of sales, so almost $3 million. And then how do I whittle this down to just those that met the $500 threshold? I'm going to put another copy of sales on filters, but this is very important. So I'm not going to pick sum of sales here because this would just be sum of sales right now with no dimensions on my worksheet is just $2.9 million. So this would just be like, is 2.9 million higher than 500? Yes, not helpful. What I'm going to do is say all values. This is more like a row level filter. And then in all values, I'm going to say at least 500. So now I can see that, orders that were $500 or higher made up 1.8 of our 2.9 total, $2.9 million in total sales. Okay. So for some kind of a simple situation like this, you might be able to just add a filter to be able to do a SUMIF. It could get more complex though, right? So in this case, how did our revenue of transactions $0 to $500 compare to the revenue of transactions that were $500 to $1,000? Okay, so we're going to write another calculation. Okay, and so in this case, I'll call this like 0 to 5. Let me see, 0 to 500 versus 500 to 1,000 sales. Terrible name, but oh well. Okay, so now the first step I'll say if sales is less than or equal to 500, then 0 to 500. Else if sales is less than or equal to 1,000, then 500 to 1,000. And then everything else would just be not applicable, right? It'd just be $1,000 plus. So for right now, we might as well just say that. So I'll just say 1,000 plus. And we'll probably end up filtering those out of our view. Okay, so now notice here, no aggregations. So we're telling Tableau, look at every row and see, did it or did it not meet this threshold? So let's put this on our row shelf. And then let's put sales on text. Well, text is fine, I guess, actually. I actually kind of like it on columns for this one a little bit better. So like, I've worked with the Superstore data so much, y'all don't even know. So I was actually surprised to see this. So like actually more revenue was generated from sales from $0 to $500 than 500 to 1,000. Who would have thought? So sometimes the little ones, they all add up, right? And then 1,000 plus ends up being a little bit more. Okay. Quick side note here, I've got a few more topics to talk through. We should easily be good by 10. I do realize we're at 9:45, so I apologize. It's like Kirk and I were talking about this before the webinar. You always have a plan until things actually go down. So I get it. If you've actually planned exactly to the time, if you got to jump, that's okay. We are recording it, but we'll look through a couple more examples for those that can stay, and then we'll talk about some additional resources, do Q&A, and then we'll let y'all go. All right. So a few more here. So COUNTIF. COUNTIF is very similar to SUMIF, just a different aggregation. So how many transactions did we have where sales was between 0 to 500? And how many transactions did we have where it was 500 to 1,000? Okay. So I'm going to handle this one a little differently. I could write this formula the same way, but just to show you an alternative, I'm just going to call this order count 0 to 500. So here I will say if sales is less than or equal to 500, then order ID end. And then I want a unique count of the order. So I'm going to say something like, give me a count distinct. Oh, actually, no, sorry. This is actually transactions, isn't it? So in this case, because there could be multiple items that were less than $500 in a single order. I want count, right? If it just so happens that I bought a $10 item and a $20 item, that should count. Even if it's the same order ID, that should count as 2 transactions. So count, not count distinct. So there's our, that should be our count of orders 0 to 500. So save a little time. Let's right click and duplicate. And I'm going to edit the duplicate in my data pane. This is going to be 500 to 1,000. So here, because I'm doing this as 2 different calculations, this is where I need to say if sales is less than or equal to 1,000 and sales is greater than 500, right? So because I don't have both of the pieces of logic in the same calculation, it actually is very important here that I clearly define what is both the end point, but also the starting point where I want these orders counted. Okay. So now I've got these 2 different calculated measures in my data pane, and I'm just going to put these side by side. So let's see, I'll put the first one on columns. So I can see I've got 11,000 orders. That seems wrong. I'm gonna have to look at that. And then let's put this order count. I'm gonna do a shared axis chart. So I hover over the axis, get the side-by-side green axis symbol, drop that on there. And let's go ahead and show this. I'm gonna have to go check my own math here because I'm feeling not really sure how. I thought we had 10,000 rows of data. So I'm not sure how that ended up being 1,000 rows total. All right, well, in theory, that's how that's supposed to work. I'll come back to that. I don't know. I don't want to spend too much time on it just now. Yeah. Oh, and I think somebody called out an error in my logic here. So less than 1,000, greater than 500. Yeah, I think I could put this the other way around, but I think Tableau should get this either way. It's less than 1,000, greater than 500, whichever order I put that in, that should work. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I screwed that one up somehow. That's, who knows. All right. So, okay, on to our next use case, text to columns. So for those that use text to columns to split up your fields in Excel, how do you do that in Tableau? Thankfully, Tableau has something very similar called the split function. So you could write it longhand, but honestly, I think it's a little easier to just use the built-in tool. So for instance here, product ID. I actually like doing this from the data source tab if possible. So we'll see if Tableau will comply with us, and it did. So let's say what I want to do, where's that field? Product, there it is, product ID. Let's say I just want to split that number off of the end of product ID. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the drop down on this column, and then you can either just say split, where Tableau is just kind of trying to take a guess at what you want, or you can say custom split, where you get to define it exactly. 9 times out of 10, I'm using custom split. Oops, didn't mean to click it, but here we are. All right, so I'm in custom split. So it says, first of all, what's your separator? So in this case, it's a dash. And then secondly, what do I want? Well, I just want the number. So I'm just going to ask for the last column. Okay. So, but you could also ask for the first or all of the columns or multiple columns. So there's a lot of flexibility with this split operation. But if I say okay, and then I'm going to scroll to the very end of my data preview. Here it is, product ID split 1. You can see it's just our numbers. So let me do a couple things here. I'm going to right click and rename this field to just product number. And then this is going to come into play for the next thing I'm going to show you. It's not really that important yet, but I'm going to change my data type from string to number. Not something you probably typically need to do. It's just I need to do it for our last little example. Okay. So either way, it didn't actually change what was going on here, just kind of changed the data type that Tableau considers that field. And I want to use that to talk about concatenate, or maybe you know this as text join. But how do you combine multiple text fields? You know, I've got city and state in different columns, and I need to be city, comma, state, or whatever it is. So in this case, let's say I want to combine my product name and product number into a single field. So there's product name. And then let's find that product number. So that split that I just created, it's actually going to show up here as well. And actually, I could have done it from the worksheet. I just like to see all the data in the data pane or in the data source preview while I do it. Okay, so how do you combine these? How do I combine product name, product number? So I'm going to go to product name in my data pane, hit the drop down, create calculated field. I'll call it product name and number. So the cool thing is that concatenating text in Tableau, it's actually pretty straightforward. So what you just do is you just add the plus sign and then whatever you want next. So let's say I want product name and then in quotes, space, open parenthesis, and then in that parenthesis, I want my product number. So make my life a little easier here. I'm just going to drag product number in from my data pane. And then I'm going to say plus a closing parenthesis in quotations. So in theory, this should do it. You can just use the plus sign between different text objects to add them together. But I purposefully threw a wrench in our plans by changing product number to be an integer. So what does this error tell us? Tableau's like, you can't use the plus sign between text and numbers, basically, right? Either you're doing math or you're doing concatenation of text, but you can't mix and match. So Tableau's basically confused, like, this is an integer field. Are you trying to do math? No, we're not. So if you're ever trying to add like a number to regular text and you get this error, what you can do is you can just wrap that number in the string, the str function. So you would tell Tableau, hey, I know these are numbers, but don't think about it like that. Like, show me the number of characters, but think about it like it's just another text field. And then all of a sudden Tableau's like, oh, okay, we're cool then. It's fine. So, okay. Say okay. We have our field product name and number, and let's give it a whirl and see what it looks like. And I want to make that column wider, but Tableau's, of course, being mean to me right now. There we go. So some of these names are very long, but now you can see we've got the product name and then the product number in parentheses behind it. It's perfect. Okay, cool. So that was kind of the rundown of some of the functionality that I wanted to talk about. So we have gotten a couple questions, and I'm going to get to those in just a moment. But to make sure that I have time to sort of tell you about what next, let's jump straight into that. So first of all, my note here says I'm getting these resources out next week. I'm hoping to get them out this week, so we'll see. But maybe as soon as tomorrow, I will let you know. It's going to be a bit of work to compile all this and publish it, but I'm hoping to have it done. So you'll have this workbook and the data source and the recording and everything to be able to go back through if you want to explore some of this. I'm probably going to send out like 10 or 12 other resources as well, just kind of related videos and blog posts that maybe go into more detail on some of the topics that we only got to cover on a high level here. So definitely encourage you to check out the YouTube and the blog and all of that. And I want to tell you about a few events that we have coming up, as well as, well, I'll tell you about it in a second. So first of all, let me tell you about some classes that we have coming up. So, and probably what's most relevant will be kind of stuff hedging into the new year, and I'll send all these links out in the follow-up as well. But we've got some kind of level 1 and level 2 Tableau classes. We've got a class called Mastering Tableau Calculations, which is 8 hours of class time just solely devoted to working on calculations, because as you can see, there's a lot to do there. So I'm going to send you links to a lot of those. If you, or maybe if a colleague is a little bit earlier in your Tableau journey, I want to tell you about something that we have coming up. This is actually not a published event yet. I'm actually going to send it to you all. I'm going to send it to you right now, so you have it immediately and you can check it out. So this is something that we're kicking off in January called Tableau Weekly Learning Cohort. So I told you a little bit about my journey jumping into Tableau in 2014. And what was really valuable for me was learning Tableau in a team-based environment. And I don't just mean classes, although those were super helpful for giving me sort of the background of what Tableau was all about. But I was really fortunate to kind of jump into Tableau from a smaller consulting firm. And I got to work with a lot of really brilliant people that had different strengths than me. There was, oh, this person's really good at visual design. This person's good at custom mapping. This person's good at calculations. And when we got to have these weekly sessions where we worked through different prompts together, we worked through different content, and we got to see what did other people do. We got to have an expert there that helped us. And so that's what the Tableau weekly cohort is all about. So there is kind of a backdrop of you need to have a little bit of Tableau skills, maybe have taken a basic class. But then from there, you're going to be meeting with a small team, roughly a half a dozen people for 8 weeks, 1 hour a week. You're going to do a little work outside of that. And there's going to be, different focuses, whether it's analyzing data or dashboarding or table calculations or whatever it might be. So that's what I just sent you. I'll send that link out along with the follow-up as well. But I thought you all might find that interesting, either for yourself, again, if you're kind of trying to get more into Tableau and maybe you don't have that colleague sitting next to you, or maybe you work from home and there's nobody to talk to, or maybe, yeah, maybe it's for a colleague that that's in a similar spot. So, yeah, that'll be part of the resources. I'll link out some of the relevant classes as well, and then we also just teach classes privately too. So if you think, hey, my whole team could probably use a class, cool, we can do that. Okay, so we've got a few minutes here, and I'm happy to run a little late, so I'm going to look through the questions. If you have any questions that you haven't asked yet, but you want to, feel free to write those out, and I'll try and tackle these. I might even work my way a little bit backwards. So there was a question there. How are you enlarging the calculations? So a couple things. The fastest way to do that is I just hold down on the control key, and then I just use the pinwheel on my mouse to scroll forward, and then that enlarges the text. I think control and then 2 fingers on the trackpad does the same thing. So that's super nice, as you can probably tell when I'm presenting, and it's like can't see it because it seems so small. Hopefully that helps. And then I've actually got an add-on tool on my computer called Zoom It, that's where I zoom in and draw on my screen and things like that. Yeah. Okay, cool. Hold on 1 second here. I'm gonna enlarge my window. Yeah, so there was a question like, so what happens if you have like a hard return or like a wrap in Excel and Tableau doesn't pick that up? So this would probably be a little bit tricky, but like, let's say you had like a city and state, right? So it was like Seattle, Washington, and I wanted to put a comma in there. I would probably use the find function in Tableau to find where that space is. And then, or actually maybe even easier, I could split this, split it first, last, and then just use, split 1 plus comma space plus last. Where this probably gets a little more complex would be something like what happens when you have a 2-part city or a 2-part state. So it almost might be easier to keep city and state as their own separate columns and then kind of configure it in Tableau if that's happening a lot. But yeah, Tableau typically won't really interpret like line breaks in a Excel cell very well. Yeah, there was a question about how would you get counts of different types? Like I need a count of contracts for, this criteria and for that criteria. So honestly, I mean, I think that kind of what we did with the count functions, it would be similar. So you could say something like if, state equals California, then order ID, or if, whatever your criteria is, if the contract is this type of thing. So maybe that would help. I don't know. I think it would be kind of along the lines of what we looked at with COUNTIF. And that question may have preceded that as well. So I apologize if that was a little out of order. Yeah, there was a question, how do you do joins based on multiple criteria? So yeah, if I go back to the data source tab, it's not true of any of the data for what we are dealing with, but what you would do there is like, let's say there was region and state. So I would hit a drop down and then I would pick a second criteria that I want to join on as well. So that doesn't really work for our use case, but that's how that would work. Yeah. Yeah, there was a question, can you change default font colors for something like a dashboard? Yeah, absolutely. So where you would go for that is in the dashboard dropdown on your toolbar and then format. If you popped that window up, then there's the ability to change like your default font colors. I think I've already hand overwritten and made it white instead of the default gray. So I don't know if it will do it just now, but that would in theory be able to change some of the default if you haven't gone and changed them already. Yeah, so to talk about that split again, so popping back over to data source. So what I did there was, let's find that product ID field. So I'd hit the drop down on product ID, and then I went into custom split. So what I was basically telling Tableau with the custom split is the way that I set it up is I want everything after that last dash. So how does that work? I put a dash in the separator and just ask for the last column. So, for something like first name, last name, city, state, this can be really useful for phone numbers, for email addresses, can allow you to pick something and then be able to split the values either before or after that. Well, I think we may have made our way to the end of the questions. So here's what I'm going to do. I'll be working on compiling a lot of these resources. I just sent you all my email in the chat. So if you had anything else that either I missed or maybe you just didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to shoot me an email on that, and happy to tackle that then. So cool. Thank you again so much for being here. It's been fun. I hope this was valuable. Nice to hear from a lot of you in the chat. To see that hopefully this was useful. So yeah, we look forward to getting this out to you soon, and then hopefully, yeah, we'll get to run into you again here in the next couple months. Thanks so much.